Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. From our Southern Fire Exchange team, today I'm joined by Marinelle Armstrong with Tall Timbers Research Station and Elliot Nowert from NC State University. Today we have a presentation by Dr. Matt Thompson from the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. Dr. Thompson will be talking about multi-leveled institutional and structural systems that are influencing how we're managing wildland fire in the US, thinking in terms of slack and scarcity. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Matt Thompson is a research forester with the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team in the Human Dimensions Program at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Matt received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers in 2016 and the Deputy Chief's Early Career Scientist Award in 2013. He has a certificate in strategic risk and decision-making from Stanford University. Matt also has a Ph.D. in forest engineering from Oregon State University, an MS in forest management from Oregon State University, and an MS in industrial engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. And he also has a BS in systems engineering from the University of Virginia. So with all that, Matt, we're excited to have you here today. Thanks for joining us. And one moment, everybody, as we trade out presentations.
Okay, slack and scarcity in wildfire management. Yes, wildfire and the many decision support tools that we have built regularly deal with things like allocation of scarce resources. I would argue that there's a set of converging forces that are creating what I would call a new era of scarcity in wildland fire. So there are viable solutions are urgently needed that in effect enable the broader wildland fire community and the system to do more with less. And so some of the questions that motivated this research are, how can we perform better under increasing scarcity? What role might there be for slack to play? How can we kind of strategically create and leverage slack? And when I say slack, I'm thinking in terms of dampening time pressures, reducing uncertainties, expanding options, expanding the decision space, if you will, as well as exploring some things like contingency and redundancy. And I think this kind of problem frame provides a really rich context for innovation and delivery of actionable analytics that will ideally help the wildland fire system better protect landscapes, communities, and responders. So I'll begin by kind of briefly articulating the problem as I see it. And again, to acknowledge this is very much kind of a Western-centric frame. But we're seeing wildfire activity increasing. Here on the screen, we have fires from 2020 in Colorado that had us choking up a lot of smoke. The Cameron Peak and the East Troublesome, two of the largest fires in state history. Then we also have the impacts of fire worsening. So here again are two fires from recent years in Colorado. The Grizzly Creek fire resulted in a lot of post-fire flooding that shut down the interstate at huge economic cost. And then more tragically, the Marshall fire, the single largest structure loss event in Colorado history, happened in the foothills outside of Boulder. And these kind of compounding risks of post-fire erosion events and others are going to continue to grow in frequency and impact. One of the lenses that our team really focuses on is not just the biophysical and kind of impacts of fire, but the consequences that has in terms of workload and in terms of impacts to our personnel. So I think that the Dixie Fire is really kind of a microcosm of a lot of the challenges that are coming to us. People will often refer to extreme wildfire events as measured by things like spread rate, size, resistance to control. I think the Dixie represents what we may now term an extreme workload event. So there was over 360,000 total person days on this fire. That equates to one crew member working for about 1,000 years. They built enough containment line to go from Seattle to Pittsburgh. I think actually this is an older figure. I think maybe the accurate number is more like 3,500. It's enough to go from Seattle to Chicago and back. 1 out of every 4 fire personnel assigned were on the Dixie Fire from all states across the union. And you know, the suppression expenditure was 1/3 of annual costs. It exceeded the 2020 hazardous fuels budget for the Forest Service. So it's just a major impact. And that comes against the backdrop speaking kind of from my Forest Service hat, of a very strained wildfire response system. So these are some quotes from recent testimony and recent news. We're having a hard time filling a lot of these positions. There are issues of recruitment and retention. There are quotes in front of Congress that the system was simply not designed to handle this, and the firefighting workforce is stressed like no other time in our history. Let me just make sure I'm going ahead. Okay. Now, adding to that scarcity, of course, hopefully this is in the rearview mirror, where the impacts of the pandemic and the single event on the Cameron Peak resulted in over 2,000 worker days missed just because of the sheer amount of people that had to go into quarantine from the outbreak. So conditions of scarcity are amplifying, and of course climate change is going to amplify those as well. These are some figures from recent drawings, and we don't need to go into too much detail, but the one on the left basically shows that we're going to have more extreme spread events. And so that's going to be more resistant to control fires that are going to burn larger areas. And then on the right, we see some work that's showing as we go into the future, we're going to have more days of synchronous fire activity. That is elevated fire danger in multiple parts of the country at once. So it's plausible that we could have multiple events like the Dixie going on in different geographic regions of the country. And of course, scarcity has consequences. So on the left here, we're showing unable to fills, which is a measure of just kind of suppression capacity. And when you have resources that are unavailable to incident management teams, then they're not able to execute in a timely way on the strategies and tactics that they're trying to deploy. And as a result, oftentimes we're forced to triage, and sometimes triage results in unintended outcomes. This is from the Tamarack fire in California, where I think it was around 40 other initial attacks were going on at the same time. This one was triaged due to being relatively more remote and not immediately threatening values. But then conditions changed and it ended up crossing the Nevada state line and burned down some structures. And so that resulted in also major political consequences. So and what that means is, the decision space for wildland fire is and can be incredibly complex, right? So we're orchestrating the logistics of different types of resources, crews, engines, aerial assets. We have time windows within which things are more or less likely to be effective. Oftentimes there's prep work that's necessary. So it's a complicated environment, and I think what that means for us is that there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of work to do to kind of deliver analytics, proven analytics that can help us be more adaptive and intelligent in our deployment of fire personnel. Obviously, there's a huge amount of investment going into hazardous fuels reduction, and I know there's a very vigorous prescribed fire program in the Southeast, and that's critical. But in many cases, especially in the West, implementation of these landscape fuel mitigation strategies are going to take a decade or more to really realize their benefit. So in the interim, wildfire response will remain the linchpin to help protect landscapes and communities. And in the face of these elevated risks, against that backdrop of arguably degraded capacity, it's really imperative that we operate more efficiently and effectively. So with that, I'll go a little bit into slack and scarcity. Again, earlier I talked about scarcity in the context of just limited resources. I'd like to kind of expand the thinking on scarcity really in the context of how it affects our decision making. So this is a really great book if folks are interested, and it really talks about how under conditions of scarcity, we actually tend to narrow our focus. We tunnel. We tend to focus on the short term over the long term. We become even more susceptible to things like decision biases and heuristics, which we already know are very common in the complex, dynamic, and unpredictable nature of wildland fire. And it really relies on it. And increasingly, we rely on that kind of intuitive expertise and not the slower, more deliberative way of thinking. And so, our argument is that maybe we can buy ourselves some slack. Maybe we can buffer against that scarcity in the sense of how it affects our management and decision-making by buying ourselves more degrees of freedom, by being strategic about the role of redundancy and focusing on things like effectiveness over efficiency. And just by way of a little bit of background in terms of our group, like David said, I'm part of the wildfire risk management science team, and so we kind of organize our research with a lot of those themes in mind. So we try and work across this risk management cycle, from planning to decision making and executing to monitoring and learning. But in particular, those two gray boxes highlighted, we're really trying to deliver as best we can decision support that's operationally relevant, with the explicit goals of kind of helping managers allocate those scarce resources while addressing factors related to time pressures, uncertainties, decision space. We want to increase that probability of success. We want to increase responder safety. And a big focus and effect of our work is how can we buy more slack, and how can we better understand its role in relation to things like suppression resource allocation and suppression effectiveness. And so that kind of segues me into this idea of what we call Moneyball for fire. So it's really about kind of borrowing lessons from the sports analytics revolution and seeing how they can be deployed in the context of fire. And so, analytics is probably it falls in the category of buzzword these days, but really it's fairly simplistic, right? It's just the extensive use of data and statistical and quantitative analysis to help drive kind of data-driven, evidence-based management. And I know it originated in the world of baseball, as made popular by the book and the movie Moneyball. I'm more of a basketball player myself, so I really appreciate kind of these metrics that show, for example, a number of years ago, the Houston Rockets were one of the most efficient offenses in the entire nation, and that's because they, in effect, identified and designed their offense around only taking the shots with the highest efficiency. So that's three-pointers and in effect, layups. With that said, there are kind of really important human aspects of Moneyball that I don't want to overlook. It's not just that data is going to make the decision for you, and decision support models are just that, support, not decision-making models. And so, the human side, the focus on trust and competency, I think is really important. It's a false narrative that these things are a substitute for human judgment and decision-making. It's a complement. And so what you want to try and cultivate are neither people who are unquestioning of the analytics or people who don't trust the decision models and go with their gut. You want these informed skeptics, and it's been that's kind of been in the back of our mind as we try and deploy this Moneyball analogy. And so, that leads me to this idea of an analytics management framework. This is also borrowed from kind of some lessons from the sports analytics revolution. And the point here is that it really needs to be tailored to kind of organizational problems. You need to align to goals, and you really need to kind of have the people and the process right, in addition to things like the technology right. So the communication and kind of strategic orientation are really important here. And just kind of taking a survey of where the state of the art is. Please don't try and read too much into this table. I just want to highlight that one row, which is to say there's been an explosion of applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence in wildfire, but very little in the specific context of like fire operations. And so a great quote from this recent review: an important challenge for the fire research and management community is to enable the transition of these potentially useful models to inform fire management operations. And I would say that in effect is kind of a motivating feature of our work. And so when we think of analytics, I generally try and break them down into these three categories. There's descriptive, what did happen; predictive, what could happen; and then prescriptive, which is to say what should happen. And there are other categories of analytics like diagnostic and clinical, et cetera. But for our purposes here, I think these are pretty valuable. So in the example here, this is a real world fire in California, and we're showing descriptively where they built line, fire containment line, in relation to what held and what burned over and what never engaged the fire. In the middle, we're actually showing a predictive model that shows where on the landscape fire control is likely to be more successful. And then on the right, and this is very much proof of concept at this stage, is a model that says, given the values at risk and where on the landscape control is likely to be higher, here's kind of the box you may want to create. And so starting with descriptive analysis, this is some work that we've been doing for a number of years now. This is a figure from Matt Plusinski from Australia that I think nicely highlights this kind of spatial framework. So again, what it's doing is it's taking the locations of built fire containment line and spatially analyzing that in relation to the final fire perimeter. And you can come up with a whole host of pretty simplistic ratios that basically describe how much line did you build in relation to the final fire perimeter, and then of the line that you built, how much ultimately held. And so we're beginning to kind of pilot and prototype these as performance measures within the agency. Also, just frankly, in advance of that as a platform, just to better understand suppression effectiveness and the factors that drive it. So this is an example of kind of going from the stylized to reality. These are 4 fires that show this in a real world context. And every fire is unique, and every fire has its own kind of story to tell. So for example, on the 416 fire, that was outside of Durango, Colorado, and they were worried about it threatening to grow to the north to a ski resort. And so a lot of those unengaged contingency lines were them preparing for, what would happen if the fire were to continue to spread to the north. So again, this is not to be used for things like Monday morning quarterbacking. It's really around how can we learn what works and what doesn't and why. And so as an example of kind of putting numbers to this, the Soberanes fire, of the total amount of line that was built, about 27% successfully held. And it turns out that is not too far off. We've now analyzed hundreds of fires, and on average, for every 3 miles of fire containment line we build, about 1 mile will hold. And so we've kind of come up with this fairly simplistic 2-dimensional framework that compares how much suppression effort, total line in relation to the fire perimeter, and then how much line held. And we're beginning to use this framework then, as I said, to kind of explore factors that we're learning drive effectiveness. And so the bar charts, the box plots rather, on the right, just kind of break fires down on the basis of whether they were burning in remote areas in the backcountry or, closer to threatened infrastructure and other values at risk. And not surprisingly, in the front country where there's more values at risk, we tend to build more line, and we tend to build more ineffective line, which is perfectly consistent with risk-informed decision-making. We may be willing to take lower likelihood shots because there's a bigger payoff if those containment lines are successful. Okay, segueing a little bit now from descriptive analytics into predictive analytics. I would argue that this is probably where our collective team has had the most success in the past 5 to 7 years. It's really about that kind of blending of subject matter expertise, of local expert knowledge with some of these analytics. And so we try and do these things called pod workshops. Pods are potential operational delineations. Basically, they're fire containers whose boundaries are relevant to fire control operations. Things like roads, ridges, fuel breaks, water bodies, etc. And so pods are now kind of widely deployed, at least on many of the Western national forests. I think about 70 or 80 national forests in the Western United States have pods. We've had some conversations with folks in the Southeast about how they might be operationalized there. That's still a work in progress. The infrastructure bill that was passed last year devoted $100 million to Department of Agriculture and Interior to host pod workshops and identify potential control locations in advance of fire, kind of codifying the importance of that more proactive planning in advance of fire. And furthermore, in the infrastructure bill, there was about $500 million that was devoted to fuel treatments along those potential control locations to, in effect, harden those boundaries for not only for fire response operations, but arguably to kind of support implementation of prescribed burning as well. Pods have kind of become part of the implementation of the Forest Service's wildfire crisis strategy. They're being recommended for use in our implementation of prescribed burning. So it's kind of had a pretty good success story in terms of that translation analytics into planning. And what we're marrying these pod boundaries with is a lot of quantitative wildfire risk assessment. And so what that does is it basically kind of combines fire modeling that characterizes the likelihood and intensity of fire with identification of all of the values at risk. So typically we're talking municipal watersheds, wildland urban interface, recreation values, critical infrastructure, could be timber, could be wildlife habitat, et cetera. And in some cases, we're actually kind of on that basis stratifying the landscape into zones where we would have different predominant kind of response objectives. So areas in green is where we want to maintain the natural role of fire. Areas in red are where we're going to be more oriented towards protection because of proximity to things like communities and critical infrastructure. And then areas in yellow are sort of in between where we want to restore fire, but there may need to be some hazardous fuels or other work done in advance. I think the important part to really hammer home here is that these plans can be translated into action. And so one of the early adopter forests in Arizona had done pods in 2016, and in 2017, they got a lightning strike in an area that they had identified as a restore zone. So under the right conditions, it was an area where they wanted to restore fire. And so that final fire footprint almost perfectly aligns with the pre-identified pod boundary. And so they've since submitted reports that talk about, the desirable mosaic they got of burn severity. And in fact, in 2021, that area reburned in a much larger, more resistant to control fire, the telegraph fire. And burn severity maps show this really nice green donut hole. And that was the benefit of having managed the Pinal fire instead of aggressively initial attacking the fire, because they had that comfort level, because they had done that planning. And so this is that figure I was just alluding to, where you can see that there's actually much more desirable effects in the footprint of the Pinal fire. And arguably, it helped arrest the spread of the fire to the north and east, where it could have negatively impacted some downstream communities. What we're trying to do now, especially with all of the effort and energy around the crisis strategy and priority landscapes and a huge pulse of investment for hazardous fuels treatments, is trying to leverage a lot of these, kind of response-based planning tools and porting them over into the landscape fuel treatment prioritization realm. One obvious nexus, as I alluded to earlier, is just hardening pod boundaries by roadside fuel treatments and creating a network of fuel breaks. That in and of itself may be kind of insufficient as a strategy. So that's why they need to be paired with, for example, interior prescribed burning. I'm showing some examples from here in Colorado, where we're trying to strategically link treated pods to form this north-south ribbon that can be the catcher's mitt, if you will, because a lot of the fires here kind of burn from the west downslope to the east. This, as I said, is out of date. Obviously, it's 2023, not 2021, but it's just showing that we're kind of seeing growing adoption by, at this point, most national forests in the Western U.S., as well as a lot of state agencies, in particular, like the Washington Department of Natural Resources, has codified pods into their strategic, 20-year forest plans, and other states are working on that as well. So it's kind of exciting progress to see. Now we can see, kind of continuing on the thread of predictive analytics, we can see this nexus with incident decision support. So kind of in parallel to the pods effort, the agency, the Forest Service, created what it called the Risk Management Assistance Program. And that was designed to provide kind of timely and relevant decision support for some of our most complex fires. So, think the large fires you may hear on the news. These are managed by Type 1 or Type 2 incident teams. And they're providing basically a common set of analytics. So what the Risk Management Assistance Program is providing in real time for incident support is a common platform of analytics that we're also deploying for this pod-based planning. And so what we're seeing kind of emerge is this growing familiarity where maybe on an incident, you've seen these analytics before because you engaged in a pod-based planning. Or maybe when you show up at the table for a pod workshop, you can recall that you've seen how these analytics could be leveraged for real-time support. So this is just an example of some of the analytics. The Moose Fire was in Idaho, and this is showing that it was burning. Actually, when I I gave this presentation a summer ago in Estes, and as I was talking, this fire was actively burning, so that's why I picked it. But you can see that it's some really thorny country. The areas of red are where the difficulty of suppression, a function of access, terrain, trail and road density, fire behavior, and heat per unit is really challenging. So it began to help them identify where should we perhaps not be sending firefighters due to concerns of elevated exposure to operational hazards. And so, I think this has been a multi-year effort, and there's been a lot of people involved. But it really kind of, the analogy, I think itself has been one kind of inroad, which is for the longest time, I had been saying things like, we need to shift towards evidence-based management, or we need to have more, cultural appreciation for data-driven decision-making, and just, woo. But, the power of language and the power of analogy, I don't think I fully appreciated. So I think the Moneyball analogy in some settings has played much better. Another point that I'll make in terms of like analogy communication is that it's one thing if I go into a workshop and talk about the value of predictive analytics and the value of pods. Some other folks on our team, have been a hotshot for 10 years or have been in fire operations for even longer than that. The same message coming from them is far more credible and viewed far more favorably, and therefore we get more success. So I think, it's not only how you frame the message, it's who is the messenger. And so I think that's also been a real good take-home point. And we're really fortunate in our group that we work with a lot of folks with strong operational backgrounds, not only because they can help convey the message, but also they can help kind of gut check us and make sure that we're on the right path. Okay, and then, segueing into prescriptive, again, this is more that what should you do? And I hate to use the word should in the context of incident management teams, because like I said, I'm not necessarily the appropriate one to be making recommendations. But in the research realm, I think there's some really interesting questions that we can start to ask. And, one of them is just exploring how might you optimally kind of spatially connect these pods, given, constraints like resource availability, potential for fire to negatively or beneficially impact values, and risk preferences. And so this is some work that we put out a couple of years ago. We're still kind of test bedding these ideas. Another idea that we're working with is exploring the role of redundancy and the PACE model, which is primary, alternative, contingency, and emergency. And we're beginning to understand that like different approaches to building redundant lines in the system have kind of different implications for workload, for personnel exposure, and for likelihood of success. And so, in parallel to us exploring in the research domain, like what is the role of contingency, what is the optimal level of redundancy, we're also kind of test bedding some of the ideas on the basis of using those analytics, where our needs for contingency line greatest, where are more indirect tactics, likely to be safer and more effective, et cetera. And we're beginning to kind of have a line of sight to how doing that work in advance actually can improve outcomes with our descriptive analytics. And so this is, again, examples from the Tonto National Forest in Arizona, where as sort of a nice natural experiment, they had 3 unplanned ignitions in 3 areas of their landscape that were zoned very differently on the basis of wildfire risk. And so the Brooklyn fire on the top left was an area where they wanted to maintain the natural role of fire. And as a result, they were not necessarily having to go very aggressive and build a lot of line to contain it. So 90% of the line that they built held. It was a very effectively managed fire. By contrast, on the top right, that's the Highline fire that was threatening communities. And so not surprising, and again, kind of consistent with risk-informed management, they exerted a lot more suppression effort, and a lot of the line that they built ultimately didn't hold. But again, that's consistent with this idea of the juice is worth the squeeze, if you will. They built more line that had a lower likelihood of success because the payout was much greater. Not shown here, but some work we have in progress that we're hoping to submit pretty soon here, is we analyzed about 80 fires from the 2021 fire season and we stratified them on the basis of whether they had a pre-existing pod network in place or not. And we are showing some statistical signal that, in fact, those places that had done the pre-fire planning and had those pods in place had more effective fire containment line. Okay, that was a lot about Moneyball. And in fact, since the time that a lot of these slides were initially generated, there's been a lot more movement in the system. At this point, the risk management assistance dashboard is like available wall to wall online with a whole bunch of analytics uploaded to it. It has been used at this point now on hundreds and hundreds of incidents, large and small, federal and non-federal. And again, the kind of companion, that pods-based planning is now growing in scale and size. And I think there's a lot more kind of non-Forest Service entities becoming involved, including, I think, importantly, a lot more tribal engagement in some areas. So with that, I'd now like to kind of expand the scope a little bit, and from the level of the landscape and the incident to kind of talk more broadly about the wildland fire response system, if you will, Moneyball for the fire system, how we're trying to scale some of these similar ideas into improving safety and effectiveness and resource allocation writ large. And, you know, one of the questions we want to dig into a little bit more, I alluded to this when I showed the magnitude of the Dixie, you know, that extreme workload event, is just kind of understanding across years and across geographies, like what are the systemic impacts of those extreme workload events. So here, these two slides show over 2020 and 2021, the impact that individual events can have. So on the bottom left, for example, that pulse of yellow is just the bootleg fire. Staying in 2021, that middle green that is pretty long in duration and accounts for at its peak almost 25% of all personnel, that's just the Dixie fire. So we're talking about all fire personnel assigned across the country, and there's a huge amount, you know, associated with just a single event. So they can be real resource sinks, and we're trying to better understand what happens if we have multiple events like that simultaneously. What happens if we have fewer workforce available? And so this is just a similar kind of way of you know, showing that instead of the temporal sequence. This is now just a bar chart, but again, you can see that just about every year there are, you know, anywhere from one to multiple major resource sink events. What do we do with this information, and how does it affect resources availability and decision making on other fires is frankly a work in progress. But I'm not even aware that we had really come to this understanding of the degree to which these events were extreme workload events and resource sinks. Another area that we're trying to work with is really understanding kind of resource movement and travel demand. And more importantly, not just to understand from a historical perspective what has happened, but moving forward, what that might mean for resource availability. So on the left here, we have these kind of movement, these migration patterns that show things that a lot of the people in the fire management community will obviously be aware of. For example, there's an early fire season in the Southwest, and they historically have received a lot of resources coming from the Northern Rockies. What happens if the Northern Rockies fire season shifts so that it happens earlier and those resources are unavailable to the Southwest because they're staying in the Northern Rockies, addressing fires up there? So, you know, I think these are just open questions. The figure here on the right just shows how frequently these resources are moving around the system. And then some work by my colleague, Aaron Belval. This is a number of years ago now. But, you know, what we're trying to hopefully illustrate is that there are ways in which we can, just with some modest tweaks to current patterns and systems for resource allocation, we can ideally achieve the same level of resource availability, but significantly reduce travel demand, which is one of the greatest hazards, as well as kind of more equitable allocation of workload to reduce kind of the impacts of fatigue and burnout. And so what she did in this analysis is basically reallocated crews with an optimization model that was managing for balanced workload and reduced travel time. And you can see relative to historical, that horizontal bar up top, in all cases, in most cases, she was able to significantly reduce travel distance as well as a more balanced workload. Another thing we're beginning to tease out, again, going back to this better understanding of suppression efficacy and what drives fire line effectiveness, we're beginning to tease out things like the influence of past fires, the influence of past mechanical treatments, the severity at which the fire burned, and then as shown here, the magnitude of the bubbles is actually the total personnel assigned to the fire. So perhaps not surprising, the bigger bubbles where we have more personnel assigned to the fire are also the fires where we tend to build a lot more line and with lower degrees of efficacy. So there's clearly something unique about those fires that we need to learn more about. What are these patterns? And again, kind of writ large, what we're finding for a variety of reasons and across a variety of geographies and types of fires, that for every 3 miles of fire line we build, about 1 holds. Question is, can we improve that? If so, how, and with what benefit? And I think the benefits in terms of how we're framing them is in terms of that slack in the system. That's more firefighters available for other fires as they're burning, or to manage just against fatigue and burnout again. I think, a colleague, Brad Petruska, did some back of the envelope calculations, and a 1% improvement in amount of held line equates to something like 155 miles of line built, 25,000 hours, basically 1 hotshot crew for a season. So they're meaningful. I think there's real value in kind of intentionally orienting ourselves around even modest improvements in efficacy to build more slack in the system. And I think what we're hopefully able to show is that by investing in a lot of that proactive planning, and digesting, becoming familiar with, and interpreting these analytics on incidents, we can get a lot of the way there. I've heard managers refer to use of these analytics as you can get a 70% solution in 30 minutes. And so what that means is there's a lot of value there just to understand what these tools can be telling you, and to get you started. Now, what that's also saying is it's not a substitute for having boots on the ground to do scouting or a role for human judgment, but just beginning to see that value. So this is my last slide. So I'll be more than happy to take questions after this, but just to kind of recap, I know I threw a lot out there, and I know also that it's not necessarily as relevant to fire concerns in the Southeast. Again, we're trying to kind of see how we can adapt a lot of these analytics like the suppression difficulty index and potential control location modeling to kind of be more tailored. But writ large, what we're trying to do is build more slack into the wildfire response system. At the level of landscapes and incidents, we think we can do that by kind of pre-planning that identifies those potential control locations. That's what PCL stands for. And a lot more kind of scenario analysis. What if gaming out scenarios, and under what conditions would different contingency and indirect strategies be more or less appropriate? Talking about building and hardening strategic containment units and pods. As I alluded to, there's a whole bunch of money from the infrastructure bill to not only host pod workshops and do this planning, but also $500 million for treatment along their edges. That comes in tandem with a categorical exclusion that allows up to 3,000 acres treated along roads and other kind of fuel breaks and pod boundaries. So a lot of forests that I'm familiar with here in the West are kind of leveraging that new mechanism, if you will. And so they're beginning to do a lot of pod hardening with fuel treatments, ideally to be followed up with interior broadcast burning. And revisiting the role of contingency, lastly, for that incident. And how can prior scenario analysis and use of these analytics kind of help us come up with better contingency strategies. And then scaling up to the system, it's really, as I said, it's a very strange system at the moment. Challenges with mental health, with recruitment, with retention. I'm addressing a very narrow slice of that problem, to be very clear, but I think we can begin to kind of manage for workforce capacity and capability. We can begin to manage for more balanced workloads. We can kind of strategically induce resource scarcity into the system that preserves that slack for later in the year. We can do this by having tools that help with prioritization and allocation across geographic areas and across incidents. And by having these new tools for performance measurement that help us really understand, the degree of effectiveness our containment efforts are having, maybe in the future, we could be moving towards something where we're tracking containment efficacy in real time. And across all of this, I think it's really essential that we kind of have more adaptive and agile allocation. And I think, of the many things that need to happen for that to become true, I think this idea of Moneyball for fire, recognizing both the data and analytical side, but also kind of the human aspects, the language, communication, trust, and competency can hopefully move the needle in that direction. And I am very pleased to report that my computer is still working, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Matt. Enjoyed your presentation. Once again, everyone, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. And the presentation was by Dr. Matt Thompson from the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. As we said earlier, at this point in the program, is the opportunity to provide questions for Matt and just to give him the opportunity to respond. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A tool in Zoom. Please don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A tool. We've enabled a feature in there so that you can give a thumbs up to other people's questions. So if you see another question and it's one that you would really like us to try and get to, please give it the thumbs up, and that'll help us to kind of prioritize getting to these. Matt, I have so many questions of my own that I want to throw at you and hear what you have to say, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to get to the questions that people are putting into the pod first, or into the pod. You can see where I'm going with this. That are going into the Q&A. Anyways, let's go right to it. Joe has a question in there and Joe says, what makes a pod and how flexible are they? So, imagine a lot of folks on here, pods are a new concept, and it's certainly something that we haven't heard a lot of in the East. And so where it's been discussed, could you talk a little bit about pods? And then could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on pods in the southeastern part of the US where a lot of our folks are coming from?
Yeah, so I would probably describe pods in a couple of ways, and I apologize that I kind of breezed over it. I should have spent more time kind of introducing the idea. I think of them first as both a product and a process. And I think, like many things, the process that goes into building them is probably equally, if not more important than the final result, which is just a map of a network of these fire containers, strategic fire containers. So that process itself has really kind of at least two key aspects. There's the physical cross boundary, which is, we often hear fires don't know boundaries. Neither do fire control opportunities. So it's really being, aware and intentional about drawing these potential control locations and to form closed containers in areas where it's more likely to be safe and effective to engage fire. But the second, and I think more important part again, is that it's also social cross boundary. So when this first started, we were drawing pods in an office somewhere in GIS, just using roads and watershed boundaries. And that did not get any uptake by the field because they had no participation, no input into drawing them. And it seemed mostly like a GIS exercise. Another lesson we learned along the way is that it couldn't be so insular to be Forest Service only. And we were drawing pods all over our land. And then when it came to an administrative boundary, we drew a straight line, which has no bearing on this idea of that being a safe and effective place to engage. So it's really, a workshop with all of the adjacent landowners, fire response agencies, land management agencies, stakeholders, et cetera. So, with that said, in the West, a lot of times these pods can be very large, especially if we're talking about wilderness or roadless areas on National Forest System lands. In some cases, they're on the scale of 20 to 40,000 acres, if not larger. Obviously, in many cases, we would like them to be much smaller from the perspective of just managing them, especially if we're talking about a pod that has a high density of values at risk. And so we're kind of grappling with, is there an optimal pod size, or is it really dictated by the landscape conditions? And if there are limited opportunities to engage, what can we do to address that? I would I would project that in the Southeast, they might look very different, right? Topography is very different. Density of roads is very different. Density of assets is very different. Like, for example, I don't really know if these models have a good sense for how to account for things like swamps in terms of not only how fire behaves in them, but what it means in terms of accessibility for firefighters and other personnel. So that would be an open question. I would expect that we would see, because of the greater density of the wildland urban interface, we would probably see a lot more pods that are kind of designated as protect. But I also see a great opportunity to kind of combine that with the burn block idea. Of course, the prescribed fire is alive and well in the Southeast. Maybe pods aren't necessary in the Southeast if things are going well. Maybe if there's a concern over growing wildfire risk and improved needs for kind of containment efficacy, maybe there's a role there. I think that's an open question, but a great one.
All right, we have some more questions that have come in about pods. Merrick is asking about looking at how pods have been used on incidents, and he's asking about whether or not there are comparisons for pod usage on incidents where they were managed by a local IMT versus incidents that were managed for with an IMT that came from outside of that unit that developed the pod. That's an interesting question.
That is a great question. We have begun to kind of scratch that itch a little bit, Merrick. Certainly, so in terms of just pod evaluation, CFRI, Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, as well as Courtney Schultz and her public lands policy group at Colorado State have done a lot of interview and survey-based work. So we're beginning to get a kind of multi-year span of feedback. Certainly the out of area team has been brought up on many occasions. In a slightly different context, it was brought up in a recent report that Courtney Schultz's group released on the role of fuel treatments and incident management and the degree to which their presence is communicated to teams and how out of area teams may not be as willing to leverage the fuel treatments for tactical purposes because they're not familiar with the fire regime or they're not familiar with the intent behind the fuel treatments. I think there's a very strong parallel between the use of pods. I've heard forest supervisors say they would very much like to be able to, as a future vision, kind of keep most of their fires type 3 and below so that they are managed with those local resources who were the ones who designed the pods, who were the ones who have the management intent around how we want to manage fire on this landscape. Another quick answer is on that analysis of fire line effectiveness on the basis of whether there was a pre-existing pod network. We're also hoping in the future to weave in whether it was an out of area team or not. So we're going to try and get interview and survey work, and we're also going to try and get quantitative fire line effectiveness analytics on it.
I'm going to stick with the pods theme here, and we've got another question follow up from Merrick. And Merrick is asking, how can we increase pod development and utilization for non-incident management? So he's suggesting on prescribed fire or other fuels treatments.
Yeah, so contemporaneous with this seminar, there's a workshop going on here in Fort Collins. The Southwestern Ecological Restoration Institutes are doing a cross-boundary workshop, and that theme has come up many times. I will say I don't have a great answer. Frankly, we're kind of building that plane as we fly it. I know that here in Colorado and to our north in Wyoming, there's pretty acute interest in that idea of leveraging pods for hardening the pod's boundaries. And so we're beginning to hear of metrics like length of pod boundary treated, just like acres treated. I kind of caution that in and of itself isn't a sufficient strategy. What I didn't show in this analysis is we've done some empirical analysis of fuel break effectiveness, and it's similarly, pretty low, 30%, if not lower. So relying on, pods as a network of fuel breaks alone, I don't think is going to be sufficient. So it's how do you link hardened pod boundaries with more broadcast burning? How do you strategically, spatially sequence them in ways that are relevant to like your landscape's catcher's mitt problem? We're working through that. And I know that CFRI as well as CSU are going to be doing more kind of surveys and questions on that exact question. So more to come.
I think I can imagine a potential pod in the Southeast looking more like cross-boundary prescribed burn unit development. So maybe not as much about wildfire response and suppression, but perhaps building landscapes across jurisdictional boundaries of multiple partners where prescribed fires are able to be used at larger scales. It seems like the pod process could be a framework to develop things like that in places where that could be a potential future.
Yeah, one anecdote I'll share. I really like that idea, David. I'm going to have to borrow that. Hopefully, I'll remember with attribution. But here in Colorado, this is a number of years ago now, but the local Forest Service unit was planning a prescribed burn along a boundary, and they abandoned it because they were concerned about, concerns from the adjacent property owner. On the other side, the Nature Conservancy was working with the landowner to plan a prescribed burn, but they canceled it because they were concerned about the Forest Service being concerned. And it wasn't until we engaged in this sort of cross-boundary dialogue that they realized, oh, wow. And they actually conducted a cross-boundary burn. So, that's why I'm always cautious. It's not really pods. It's the process of getting together and talking about our cross-boundary shared issues. But I think pods is just a great platform to kind of stimulate that dialogue.
Before we jump off pods, there's another question in the Q&A from Lou, and Lou is asking if, kind of getting back to how these things are developed, do pods consider, Lou said atmospheric conditions and their effects on how the fire responds. So potential fire weather and fire behavior, is that part of the the pod planning process?
Yeah, so probably in frankly unsatisfactory ways so far. Certainly when we host these pod workshops, a lot of times we'll game out some scenarios and say, let's pretend you have 97th percentile ERC and the fire starts in this location, what would you do? A lot of the risk assessment and analysis that goes into this is based on kind of fire spread and fire behavior modeling. And what we're moving towards, colleague Kit O'Connor is really driving this, is to have much more dynamic. So, a pod boundary, first of all, could be a road or it could be a trail, right? So they have very different kind of features that have, very important consequences for how you might conduct your response operations. But then also, a pod boundary is effective until it isn't. And so what Kit really wants to do is kind of have dynamic pods where, given changing fire weather and atmospheric conditions, you can update the map and see where and how your opportunities on the landscape may have changed. So we're hoping to do a better job of that in the future. And Kit currently is kind of corralling a team of postdocs, and he has money from the infrastructure bill to conduct that research. So hopefully in a couple of years' time, we'll be able to answer that question with a resounding yes.
And maybe this will be our last pod question for you. We can pick your brain on other things. Jen asked a good one though. To what extent does complex topography play a role in pod effectiveness? And I would think even like pod development. Are pods being used in places where terrain is not as much of a dominant factor in fire spread and fire suppression?
Ooh, that's a great question. Certainly, they are being used in places where terrain is complex and as a driver of it. I think that was in large part kind of a lot of the impetus behind it. So one thing I didn't really mention is that in addition to modeling kind of potential control locations and suppression difficulty, we're also looking at things like escape routes, safety zones, and snag hazard. So there's kind of a body of analytics really around kind of the complexity and operational hazards of fire. And so I think terrain plays a huge role in that. Insofar as where they might be being used in areas where terrain is less of a driver, I will have to get back to you on that. I'm sure there are so many diverse landscapes in the National Forests of the West that maybe in some cases the answer is yes. How that's affected their use and suppression efficacy is a question that I don't have the answer to, but it's a good one.
All right, this one's my question. A lot of the things that you talked about seem like require different scales of data to make these decisions. And I wondered if you could talk about how new innovations in resource tracking on incidents, to what extent will that play in making these kinds of complex decisions going forward? Is this something, is data coming from resource tracking going to be something that's helping to make these kinds of analyses? Is that a long way off, or is that something that's going to be happening sooner than later?
I hope it's not a long way off, David. The Dingle Act, I think it was passed in 2018, and it
Been a
kind of,
bit, yeah.
puts a requirement on the agencies to have location systems. And I don't know exactly where it's at in the contracting process, but I think that's moving forward, and hopefully in the near term. There have been some pilot tests. Certainly here in Colorado, there was one. I think and then separately, there's other, firms and the private sector that are kind of moving the needle there, with the focus both on efficacy and safety. I think it would be a game changer. Not only could we really kind of recreate events and learn, what happened, we could analyze patterns of movement in relation to fire line production rates and update those. We could analyze patterns of movement in relation to things like proximity to safety zones. We're working with some partners at the University of Utah, Phil Dennison and Mickey Campbell, using mobile device data from things like Strava to get like travel rates across complex terrain to predict, how quickly can firefighters move across the terrain. And we're taking that from just athletes. It would be fantastic if we had actual mobility data from firefighters. So it's my sincere hope that when Dingle Act resource tracking is operationalized, that data will be made available, not just to our group, but to all researchers to really kind of hammer out some of those questions.
So once we have those data available from resource tracking, is that when do we have the data we need now to apply AI to help make better decisions in the wildland fire, or is AI really going to take off once we have those kinds of resource tracking data available? I ask you because you can't read a newspaper, especially this week. You turn on New York Times, I think every day had an article about AI and the gentleman leaving Google.
Yeah, I actually the other day was playing around with Bard. I got an account, and one of these days I'm just going to try and see if I can write a research manuscript using it. So here's what I would say on that. I think absolutely there's a huge amount of potential for machine learning and AI in wildfire. And I think you're already seeing that growth. Since I cited that one review in 2020, there have already been several other reviews of the application. So much is centered on better resolution of fuels and atmospheric modeling of fire behavior. So much is centered on early detection. I don't think the data, frankly, is there for like large fire response operations because we just haven't really thoroughly studied that. So that's where, if you combine things like resource tracking with much finer precision on where we're engaging in different types of activities, this fire line effectiveness analysis that I showed required a lot of time-intensive data QA, QC, and unless and until we get far better quality of resolution of information on where we're doing certain types of operations. For example, tactical burnout operations are very rarely spatially documented. So there's a whole world of kind of data management on what we're doing, where, when, why, and how that needs to be there before I think we can build credible ML models for large fire decision making. One of the ironies, I think, the potential control location modeling that Kit O'Connor pioneered, that is probably the most used analytics for incident support as well as in pod workshops. And it has no information on suppression activities at all. It's just where did fires stop burning? And then you infer from that those are good locations to control. So I think there's some low-hanging fruit that we've been trying to pick, but I think we're a little ways out from credibly saying we can kind of make large fire decision models with ML because we don't have the data on what's happening.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, with that, Matt, thank you so much. I'm going to trade out and get your email address up here on the screen. And while we do that, is there anything else that you'd like to share with folks today before we close things out?
No, I think if anybody has feedback or ideas, I liked yours, David, about kind of cross-boundary burn blocks, about how this might be more relevant to the Southeast. We are all ears. So I think that would be great.
So finally, thank you so much, Matt. Really enjoyed your presentation. It's fascinating. And thanks so much for the robust conversation at the end. I really enjoyed it. And thanks everybody for joining us today. And we hope that today's webinar will be helpful and useful in your fire management programs. So have a good afternoon.
Thank you. May the fourth be with you.
Hey.